One of the earliest reasons governance emerged was to manage conflict over economic assets, particularly land and labor. In part, we pay taxes because of this question: who owns what and how is that ownership protected? But why does it even matter who owns a piece of land? Because land has value. You can grow crops on it, raise sheep on it, build a shop and sell cheese. Basically, you can build wealth from land. Property isn't just dirt, it's potential. And a massive portion of our laws today reflect that. They govern the economy. They regulate property rights, wealth distribution, trade behavior, and the standards for goods and services. There are laws about how you buy things, how you sell them, and what happens when somebody breaks those rules. All of this springs from that core function of government, making it possible for people to live together without hitting each other in the face over economic assets. So, in your fantasy world, how does your government handle this? Who enforces property rights? What happens when magic enters the mix? Do cultural attitudes around property, wealth, or inheritance shift because of fantasy? What institutions exist to manage economic behavior, and who controls those institutions? That's what we're diving into today. Welcome to another episode of Worldbuilding Blueprints with your host Marie Mullaney from Just in Time Worldbuilding. Before we dive into today's episode, I have a super exciting announcement for you. The Kickstarter for Worldbuilding Blueprints Volume 1 is now in preview, link down below. This book pulls together everything I've covered in Season 1 of the podcast. It includes all the worksheets I've used to guide the episodes, now fully revised and beautifully laid out. I've removed those worksheets from my Ko-fi site, so the only way to get them now are by becoming a channel member or by backing the Kickstarter. If you click the notify button now, you will receive an email when the project launches and you will be able to back it immediately. Backers who back the project within the first 48 hours will have their name added to the thank you section of the book. And if you back the project, you'll be able to get the book in digital format, audiobook, paperback with a black and white layout, or a gorgeous full-color hardcover edition. And no matter which format you choose, no matter which tier you back us at, the book comes with a black and white printable pack of all the worksheets, ready to drop straight into your world-building Bible. So, if this podcast has been valuable to you, if it's helped you shape your worlds, head over to Kickstarter and click on the notify link. All right, enough of that. Let's get into today's episode. So here's the thing. No economy exists in a vacuum, and no society survives without rules that govern wealth, property, and exchange. These are the foundations of the macroeconomic system. They govern how entire societies allocate and protect resources. As I mentioned, one of the earliest reasons governments or governance systems emerged was to formalize these economic rules. In early agricultural societies like those in Mesopotamia or Egypt, rulers managed land and water systems. Those assets generated food, taxes, and power. And here's the thing, wealth invites conflict. If owning a piece of land means growing crops, raising livestock, or charging others to cross your bridge, someone will want to take it. That's where rules come in. laws that define ownership, enforce contracts, and regulate trade. This isn't about preventing theft per se. It's about building trust that people will have access to their economic assets. It creates a predictable, stable environment which permits an economy to grow larger. So today, we're going to explore how economic laws develop, why they matter, and how fantasy elements change them, and the difference between institutions like guilds and companies. But before we get into the historical development of those laws, let's address a foundational question. Why don't societies just run on might makes right? Why don't people just take what they want? Because raw strength is inherently unpredictable. Today you're stronger. Tomorrow someone else is. Even warlord cultures form rules, alliances, defense pacts, even raiding norms, which make them more predictable and increase their economic yield. Cooperation, even if uneasy, is more sustainable than chaos for the growth of wealth. And this is because it is not just the most powerful warrior that grows the economy. It is the farmers, the craftsmen, the people who make leather, people who might not know one end of the sword from the other, but in order for them to thrive and grow wealthy, they must have predictability and sustainability. And in order for them to give that wealth to the warrior, they need that same predictability and inherit stability. As the saying goes, don't kill the baker, you'll want bread tomorrow. Okay, now there are fantasy elements under which this breaks down, and we'll talk about those in a bit. But first, let's look at how economic laws actually emerge in a society where fantasy isn't a system breaker. In the beginning, when societies are small and kin-based, there are no written laws. Everything operates on a commonly understood norms framework. Trade often operates on reciprocity. I give you a goat and you help me build a roof later. It's based on memory, obligation, and social pressure. Break the unspoken rules and you're not jailed, you're shunned, exiled, or maybe end up in a blood feud. We can see this kind of economy still active among the surviving hunter-gatherer societies today, like the San with their gift-giving society and so on. The thing is, this kind of economy only works if there is extreme trust. The moment your society grows beyond the kin group, the moment people can hide their laziness behind others, things change. In our world, this is where religion stepped in. In early civilizations, temples regulated offerings, sanctified contracts, and even stored grain like banks. Economic behavior became moral behavior. In Sumer, temple staff issued grain loans. In medieval Europe, the church enforced usury bans. In Islamic systems, charging interest was forbidden by religious law. These religious norms gave rise to economic rules. They set expectations around fairness, greed, generosity, and obligation. In many early societies, religion and laws were intertwined. Religious institutions help enforce contracts, dictate norms, and mediate disputes. But why does the economic law kick off with religion? I think it's because religion already had moral authority and could create widely shared norms across growing populations. At this point in a society's economic size, they need to transition from informal norms easily enforced because everyone knows everyone to more formal norms that everyone agrees on. And that kind of transition mostly happens through religious institutions. In essence, economic behavior at this point is governed by norms as codified by the religious institutions more than anything else. These norms create a macroeconomic framework within which the economy might function. And no matter what, your economy will need that framework. Eventually, as economies scaled up further and trade extended between city-states, religions were supplemented and sometimes, but not always, replaced by secular state and legal systems, creating statutes, currencies, courts, and state-backed contracts. At this point, societies with different norms might engage in trades based on rules they've both agreed on applying, and that becomes laws governed independently from the norms of either society, thus creating independent economic institutions. In essence, that's the kind of arc of macroeconomic law, from norms to religion to statehood. So, what do all these laws actually do for an economy? First, they create stability. When people know what the rules are, they can plan. Second, they build trust. Traders across distances need some guarantee that deals will hold. Third, they offer control to those in power, kings, temples, guilds, or gods. And finally, they reflect the culture of a people, their values around fairness, greed, generosity, obligation, and wealth. Okay, so far we've talked about the big picture, governments, temples, states, and property. But now, let's zoom in a little. What happens at the level of everyday exchange? What if your fantasy character isn't the king, but a brewer, a blacksmith, or a caravan trader? This is the realm of microeconomics, the smaller scale mechanisms that shape professions, prices, and private enterprise. At the street level, economic activity depends on trust, skills, and reputation. But as cities grow and professions specialize, individual trust can't govern everything. And this is where guilds begin to emerge as an institution. Guilds aren't just clubs for craftsmen. They serve very specific functions in an economy. First, they train apprentices through long-term mentorship, thus ensuring that craft knowledge survives. Secondly, they set quality standards to protect reputation. And here's one that people often forget. Thirdly, guilds control competition by limiting entry, setting prices, and fixing wages. They might even engage in intra-guild conflict, escalating up to physical violence at times to protect their monopoly. And lastly, guilds act as proto-bankers or insurers, supporting members that are in hardship. If you want a deeper dive into guilds, check out my videos on the topic, linked in the information card and video description. Of course, in a fantasy world, guilds might also enforce magical quality control. For example, only mages certified by the Guild of Arcane Trade can sell spells. Or they could set limits on dangerous crafts, for example, alchemy or necromancy. Or they could even control access to rare materials or divine favor. And we will talk more about fantasy a little later. But first, back to guilds. Over time, guilds didn't just regulate trade, they shaped local economies. In cities across medieval Europe, guilds held enormous economic power. If you wanted to be a blacksmith, you needed the guild's approval. No approval, no hammer. But guilds had limits. They worked best in small local economies where trust, reputation, and personal networks could regulate behavior. But as Europe entered the late medieval and early modern periods, a few key forces began to outgrow the guilds. First was the rise of long-distance trade. Guilds were fairly city-bound or at most region-bound. They weren't built to manage massive ships crossing oceans. And as new maritime routes opened, especially after the age of exploration, local control gave way to international coordination. This created the merchant companies, long-range, investment-backed, risk-sharing ventures that pooled capital across borders. For an example, let's look at the Hanseatic League, a powerful guild federation of Northern European merchant cities. It began as a trade alliance and it was extremely powerful. But it struggled to maintain power as centralized nation-states emerged and new Atlantic routes displaced the Baltic trade routes. Secondly, capital and risk management affected guilds. Guilds managed people and craft, but they didn't handle large-scale capital investment or speculative trade. Guilds, in fact, were quite risk-averse, and long voyages to Asia or the Americas were risky. You needed deep pockets and a way to ameliorate your risk. That's where joint stock companies stepped in. Investors bought shares. Profits and losses were distributed proportionally. It was an early form of distributed risk capitalism. For example, the Dutch East India Company, VOC, founded in 1602, was the first multinational corporation and the first company to issue publicly traded stock. It financed voyages, built its own armies, governed colonies, and even minted currency, functions previously reserved for states. And the VOC was vastly more powerful than the Hanseatic League because it could raise money from non-members by issuing shares, and thus it could outspend the League with ease. The third thing that affected guilds was political centralization. Nation-states began to form, centralized governments with kings or parliaments eager to extract revenue and enforce borders. In this more centralized world, monarchs preferred chartered companies they could regulate and tax, rather than the semi-autonomous guilds that answered only to their city councils. Indeed, some rulers deliberately suppressed guilds in favor of state-approved monopolies. For example, in France under Colbert, many guilds were co-opted or weakened as part of royal economic centralizations under mercantilist policy. And the fourth thing that spelled kind of the end of guilds was innovation and scale. Guilds often resisted innovation to protect members' jobs and skills. As I said, they were quite risk-averse. Guilds capped production and discouraged outsiders. Guilds were in fact not at all about innovation, something to remember if you're using them in your fantasy world. Anyway, industrial capitalism demanded flexibility, scaling, and technological adoption. Traits guilds were not designed for. Eventually, factories, wage labor, and patents replaced medieval production models. So in your world, barring fantastical elements, guilds may, over time, collapse under the weight of new economic structures, be absorbed into state frameworks, or evolve into professional association or craft unions with an entirely different role from the medieval economic institutions. Meanwhile, microeconomic institutions like merchant companies scaled up to become macroeconomic players, shaping not just markets but entire empires. The Medici weren't just bankers, they were power brokers, papal financiers, and political kingmakers. The VOC didn't just trade in spices, it waged war, colonized islands, and negotiated treaties. These were not businesses, they were in essence proto-states. This was mercantilism. Mercantilism dominated European economic thought from the 1500s to the 1700s. At its core, mercantilism saw the economy as a zero-sum game. Nations sought to hoard gold, run trade surpluses, and tightly control imports and exports through monopolies, tariffs, and colonial extraction. So, what changed? Why don't we live under mercantilism anymore? Well, firstly, mercantilism fueled conflict. Mercantilist competition wasn't just economic, it was military. Wars were fought over colonies, trade routes, and monopolies. For example, the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the 7 Years' War. Maintaining colonial mercantile empires was costly and unstable. Rebellions, piracy, and naval wars drained national treasuries. Secondly, we had the rise of economic liberalism. Thinkers like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill pushed back against mercantilist ideas. In The Wealth of Nations of 1776, Smith argued that wealth is created through production and exchange, not hoarding gold. He introduced the concept of the invisible hand, that free markets, not state monopolies, drive prosperity. And Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage showed that nations benefit by specializing in what they do best and trading for the rest as a means of growing wealth, rather than treating trade as a zero-sum game and trying to do everything yourself. And then thirdly, industrialization demanded flexibility. Like the guilds before it, mercantilism was too rigid for the rapidly changing demands of the Industrial Revolution. New technologies, supply chains, and capital flows were needed. And the rise of industrial capitalism required less protectionism and more investment, which didn't work under the mercantilist model. And then lastly, monopolies became dangerous. Mercantilist monopolies like the British East India Company grew so powerful they destabilized governments. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 ended with Britain abolishing the company and placing India under direct crown rule. This showed the danger of letting private companies act as states and encouraged the various governments to take back control. Basically, as the material conditions of a society changes, as innovation becomes required, often the old economic system become unwieldy and can't adapt to the new environment. As mercantilism replaced guilds, free market capitalism, in theory, replaced mercantilism. In practice, it was not free market capitalism, it was an era of unregulated capitalism powered by empire, industrial labor, and monopoly. This was not Adam Smith's vision of the free market, and this unregulated capitalism brought its own dangers. The 1800s to early 1900s saw monopolies, worker exploitation, unsafe products, and financial crashes. This led to, firstly, the rise of the regulatory state. Governments began to create legal frameworks to rein in private power. For example, Teddy Roosevelt famously busted monopolies like Standard Oil arguing that corporations needed oversight to serve the public good. It also led to the Great Depression of 1929 to 1939, where massive market collapse led to systemic reforms in banking, securities, and the creation of social safety nets. Economists like John Maynard Keynes argued that state intervention was necessary during downturns to stabilize economies. This is called Keynesian economics, if you've ever heard that term. Thirdly, global interdependence and trade institutions rose post-World War II, with systems like the Bretton Woods Agreement, the IMF, and the World Bank helping to stabilize international trade. Countries became economically interdependent, which made zero-sum mercantilism less viable. New rules, for example through the World Trade Organization, governed trade relations under shared frameworks, not unilateral tariffs. Whether we're going to go back to unilateral tariffs is a question for a different channel, not mine. But if there's one thing that I can tell you, it's this. Economic regulations are never stationary. They change a lot. Since the 1980s, neoliberal policies have reduced many state controls that arose after the Great Depression, and this has led to global deregulation and privatization. But the 2008 global financial crisis reminded us that unregulated capitalism has its instability, and we're still dealing with the fallout of that crash. What system will emerge now? Who knows? It might be something old. It might be something new. I am not in charge of that part. But for a fantasy world, it is important to remember economic systems, both macro and micro, change all the time, and they should be dynamic in your world, as should your institutions be. And when you're world building, one of the core history mapping activities you can undertake is how has your economic system changed over time? Are you currently in a mercantile phase of your world? Do you have guilds? Is your government cracking down on magical conglomerates like some sort of fantasy Roosevelt? Does your world experience boom and bust cycles? And if so, who intervenes? All of these make for fascinating questions that build depth and reality into your economy. And speaking of fantasy, having reached our world's present, let's talk about what happens when you throw magic into an economic system. At the start of this episode, I said that might makes right doesn't last forever, because power alone isn't stable. The strongest warlord today can be overthrown tomorrow by a stronger coalition. Eventually, societies, even brutal ones, tend to settle into rules. Maybe unfair rules, maybe exploitative ones, but rules nonetheless. Predictability creates prosperity. But fantasy changes that equation, especially when the power isn't evenly distributed or even human scale. So first, let's address the God-King problem. Imagine an entity like Sauron, omnipresent in his domain, backed by armies, commanding entire species. That's not a ruler, that's a God-King. You don't trade with Sauron. You obey, or resist, or get crushed. Those are your options. And in a world where such a being can personally enforce their will, your economic theories start breaking down. There's no free market in Mordor. There are no guilds, no price negotiations, just a command economy on a magical scale. So, when building your fantasy world, ask, are there semi-divine powers who distort or override normal economic incentives? Can anyone bargain with them, or is their will simply law and they are all the economic institutions their realm needs? If the answer is yes, your real-world economic models and their associated institutions do not apply. But god-kings aren't the only thing to consider, so let's move away from all-seeing semi-divine tyrants to beings like dragons, powerful archmages, or even gods with limited domains. Say a dragon is terrorizing a region, burning villages, hoarding gold, demanding daughters. The locals might reach out to another dragon, and they'll say to that dragon, "We'll give you annual tribute, food, gems, and magical items if you take out the tyrant that's terrorizing our village." Suddenly, you're in a proto-state system. One dragon rules by force, an unstable environment, very unpredictable. Another dragon establishes economic stability by taking predictable tribute from the villagers, much more sustainable. Over time, the second dragon becomes less a raider and more a ruler, one with an economic incentive to ensure predictability so that the people under his control flourish to pay him more and more tribute. From this, we see that even magical power tends to converge on rule-based behavior because peace and predictability yield more profit than chaos and destruction, especially in the longer term. Obviously, if you walk into someone else's house and you smash in their roof and you take their stuff, you gain a lot of short-term profit. But you can't do that ad infinitum and hence rules. The same applies to mages, clerical orders, even demonic patrons. If they have recurring relationship with communities, they'll develop norms, rules, and even tax systems. As I said, they could be unfair rules, they could be terrible norms, but they will develop. Okay, so those are frameworks that'll come to pass, but what if you have fantasy resources? So let's consider things like magic crystals or phoenix feathers or anti-gravity ores. Whatever your world has, it is going to have economic value because people will find a way to make it have economic value. People are inventive that way. And where there's value, there's ownership struggles, monopoly attempts, guild regulation, and black markets. Just like oil fields or rare earth metals in our world, these resources will be extracted, controlled, exchanged, and fought over. If your fantasy world contains rare high magic materials, it needs some kind of economic infrastructure to manage it, or it will collapse into magical warlordism, essentially. And you can look at examples from everything from Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere to the Malazan Empire as sources of fantasy inspiration for this. Okay, so those are the basics of integrating fantasy into the economy. But in this podcast, we like to go a little deeper than the basics, a little more in depth. So, let's talk about the big one. What if magic eliminates scarcity entirely? Imagine your clerics can create food and water on command. Your wizards can generate instant shelter, heal disease, and ward entire cities. That's not just convenience. That's Maslow's hierarchy of needs shattered at the base level. If no one ever starves, if housing is magical and free, if water flows from enchanted stones, your economy is no longer based on survival trade-offs. You're now in a post-scarcity economy. This is mostly theoretical in real-world economies, but for fantasy, we can explore this, and we've seen it in Star Trek where replicators destroy material scarcity, And in Ian M. Banks's culture, where the only currency is reputation or access to novelty, or in The Quantum Thief, where time, memories, or social capital are economic units. In this kind of world, I think people would still trade. It just wouldn't be for normal things like we imagine today trading for food or shelter. In a post-scarcity fantasy world, people might trade in status or time or narrative control or access to unique experiences or even permission to access magical or divine favor. Economics wouldn't just vanish, it would just mutate as people have moved beyond basic needs or survival. So consider the following questions. Would magic eliminate scarcity or just shift it to new things? Maybe food is free, but access to certain kinds of food is still restricted. You can get glop for no money, but a hand-grown tomato, that's expensive. Are magical services regulated or freely available? So if anybody can cast these spells by learning how do you stop just shelters popping up everywhere? Is there a license that restricts people to so many Leomid's tiny huts every day? Or how is the economic production managed or limited? And does this impose a economic trade in bargaining for those limitations to be lifted? Let's say a mage can only cast 5 shelters a day. If they run out of a shelter, do they go onto the market and trade for somebody who has hoarded their shelter? And does this create a kind of trade in slots? It's an interesting question. Another question to consider is, do elite spellcasters form a monopoly on these resources? If they do, welcome to arcane utility companies. Basically, they're the ones who now run your whole life. And what happens to labor when the basics are free? If people don't have to work, if food and water and shelter is provided absolutely free, do people still work at all? Do they work for status, prestige, or purpose instead of basic survival? It's interesting thoughts to play around with in a fantasy world. Fantasy economics get really interesting when you add not just dragons and spells, but when you ask, how does society adapt to power that bends the rules? And those are my thoughts on economic institutions and laws. Next episode, we'll discuss economic resilience and dealing with changes in a fantasy world, and how that impacts the history of your society. Don't forget to check out that Kickstarter. Before we go, I'd like to give a huge thanks to my members for sponsoring this podcast. A special shout out to A. Walyard, Neil Buckley, Necromancer JM, Epic, Katie Kofi Mug, and Tony Lamanna, just-in-timers of the Build It in Stone level. And to Nicholas Aman, Max Dozo, Husoi, Patricio, Michelle Fleck, Pablo Barrios, Glacier Maniac, Carrie, Aya Shimimaru, Tiffany Felix, and Dylan Butera, just-in-timers of the Build It in Wood level. And all the just-in-timers of the Build It in Straw level as well. Your support makes this podcast possible, and I'm so grateful for it. And on that note, I will see you soon for another episode. Remember, build what you need, when you need it, and happy world building.